Okay, we're going to finish up the final chapter that pertains to the geography and ecology of the planet during one of these time periods. Remember, we did a chapter on the Paleozoic, which is the age of fish. We did a chapter on the Mesozoic, which is the age of reptiles, or really the age of dinosaurs. And then now here's the third installment of this that brings us up to modern times, which would be the Cenozoic, the age of birds and mammals. If you remember from our discussion of the Paleozoic, we looked at climate, temperature, CO2, O2 levels over the entire period of the last 540 million years ago. And the green line shows oxygen, the red line shows CO2 levels, and the blue line shows temperature as these measures fluctuate. And if you remember, we looked at this earlier for the Paleozoic and Mesozoic. We're now looking at it and considering this final phase, which is the Cenozoic, marked with the purple rectangle. And you can see that it really is a shortened time period compared to the prior two time periods. The Cenozoic begins around 66 million years ago, and we are still in the Cenozoic today. Over this period of time, we see that there's a relationship between biological evolution and these other factors, such that the shaping of biological evolution, especially in this purple frame in the Cenozoic, is largely done by Earth climate changes that are happening throughout the Cenozoic. And you can see that with the blue line, the temperature line, dropping pretty much constantly throughout the Cenozoic, as is CO2 levels dropping constantly, mostly throughout the Cenozoic, until now, of course. And these are really driving a profound climate shift that happens in the Cenozoic that's shaping the evolution of the birds and mammals that are flourishing during this time period. And the term continental positions at the end of those backward-facing arrows is meant to convey the point that it's the continental positions that determine what the overall climate of the planet is going to shape up to be, which is going to determine what realities are affecting biological evolution. But overall, in this time period, the climate changes that are shaping biological evolution, driven by continental positions, relate to cooling and drying. And it's a trend of becoming cooler weather and drier weather that begins around 45 million years ago and sort of has progressed until the very recent time period. It's been a constant trend of cooling and drying, as you can see by the blue line dropping and the red line dropping throughout the Cenozoic. Now, this is especially true of the areas that are at high latitude, so the polar regions are becoming very cool and dry, even more so than they would be at slightly warmer temperatures. So what are some of the continental continental movements that are happening this time? This is figure 23.2 from your book. And it's the time period that's shown here is between the Paleocene and the early Eocene. Now, we're going to learn in a slide or two what these names mean, Paleocene and Eocene, but just know for now that they are early phases of the Cenozoic. So this is early Cenozoic, and we see that the continents are mostly in their modern positions. Africa and North America and South America and Antarctica, Australia, India, these are all recognizable as land masses, Eurasia, but of course there's slight differences because the sea levels are much higher at this time period, and of course the movement of the continents through continental drift is from about 60 million years ago, 50 to 60 million years ago during the Paleocene, early Eocene. The continents are mostly in their modern shapes, but they're just not in their final resting positions yet. However, they are approaching those final resting positions. So the dashed arrows in this diagram indicate where the movement is taking, where continental drift is taking the continents. Certainly North America and South America, they're going westward, and what that means is the Atlantic Ocean is continuing to get bigger and bigger and bigger until now. So if you go back to the Paleocene, early Eocene, it was a narrower, skinnier gap between Africa and South America because the Atlantic Ocean was physically smaller. The other thing that's noted on here would be, or excuse me, the dashed lines, yeah, that's the indicate continental drift, but the solid lines indicate where land bridges would have occurred, not constantly, but intermittently. As sea levels go up and down, shelves of land get exposed or submerged, and those shelves can sometimes connect to other continents where a separate kind of plant and animal ecosystem can be shared and travel back and forth. So the solid lines on this indicate where land bridges would occur, and we see that land bridges between the southern continents of Gondwana, especially Australia, Antarctica, South America, means that there's going to be a lot of floral and faunal similarity between those three land masses. But then there's also a land bridge connecting South America to North America very late in the Cenozoic, and then at the early Cenozoic there's land bridges that are connecting around the North Pole. So we see a couple of lines there basically on either side of the North Pole. North America and Eurasia are established at various times by land bridges, and this shapes the evolution of life on these continents tremendously. And it's a theme in the Cenozoic that the continental positions driving climate changes and are sharing or are defining sort of the reality for how life evolves on the continents that are in these spots. Some continents that are isolated all this time, so we're going to finish the lecture mentioning these. Madagascar, New Zealand, and India at the early Cenozoic and the Paleocene, early Eocene. These are isolated land masses. India, you can see marking with a dashed line indicating that it's drifting towards Eurasia. And now India, of course, the subcontinent of India is in contact with Eurasia, and there's a super tall series of mountains called the Himalayas that are literally where the landmass of India is crumpling into the landmass of Eurasia. That gap has been closed, but in the early Eocene, in the early Cenozoic, there was still quite a lot of distance between India and mainland Eurasia, mainland Asia. Madagascar has always been isolated off the coast of Africa, as has New Zealand always been isolated off the coast of Australia. They've stayed isolated, whereas India is no longer isolated. The climate that's changing throughout this time period is shifting pretty dramatically and through two phases. So we're going to break down the Cenozoic into the various epochs, and we can see the epochs as this kind of lavender block, Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene, then it shifts to kind of a greenish block, Miocene, Pliocene, and then we get into the Ice Ages, the Pleistocene, and then we get into the modern time period, what we call the Holocene. Now, the size of these time periods is not to scale, because you'll notice on the x-axis that there's a break in the axis and there's a different scale drawn there. So don't think that the Pleistocene is the largest time period of the Cenozoic. It's just artificially looking that way because of the way the x-axis is broken into thousands of years before present and then millions of years before present. So the ice house, the hothouse world and the icehouse world are two phases of the Cenozoic that define the early Cenozoic when it's really warm, the hothouse world, throughout the Paleocene and the Eocene. And then there's a temperature change that takes over between the Eocene and the Oligocene. And you can kind of see that here, where literally this green line is degrees Celsius dropping over the early phases of the Cenozoic, and you can see that throughout the tail end of the hothouse world, temperatures on average around the world are diminishing. And then that begins the second phase of the Cenozoic, which is a very long phase of the Cenozoic. So if the hothouse world is from around 60 million years to 30 million years ago, then 30 million years ago to now is the icehouse world, and essentially it's this phase of Earth cooling. Now, during that hothouse world phase, there's one landmark moment called the PETM. That stands for the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And you can see this spike that's right there. That spike corresponds to the time period where the Paleocene changes over to the Eocene. It's about 55 million years ago, and temperatures were at an all-time high throughout the entire Cenozoic. So it's kind of like the warmest phase of the entire Cenozoic happened at the PETM, the maximum, the thermal maximum of the Paleocene-Eocene transition. And then shortly thereafter, there's just a steady decline throughout the Eocene, and then by the time you get to the Oligocene, there's this significant, you're now in a significantly diminished global average temperature, and that begins this phase of what's called the icehouse world. And we see the Antarctic ice sheets then for the first time show up as a feature on planet Earth, and then a little bit later in time the Arctic ice sheets, and you can imagine that those are demarcating just phases of cooling and drying that have happened throughout the Cenozoic. It's a period of just a long trend of cooling and drying. One other landmark that corresponds to the cooling that I'm trying to describe here in the icehouse world is called La Grande Coupure, and it's a French term for the Great Cut. And it's what paleontologists have named this phase in the late Eocene when you start to see temperatures declining enough, climates cooling and drying enough that many species that were adapted for the sort of hothouse world begin going extinct. So there is kind of an extinction event associated with climate change where things are getting cool and dry by the end of the Eocene. Some other things to point out here in purple, this kind of scribble up and down, up and down, up and down, those are temperatures, and they're overlaid with ice sheet information. And so each one of these naders, each one of these troughs in this up and down cycle reflect a time when the ice sheets of the Antarctic and Arctic would have been at their maximum sizes. And then temperature warms, and then it gets cold again, and it warms again, and it gets cold again, and it gets warm again. And so if we were to look at the phase of the Pleistocene, which starts around 2.5 million years ago and goes until 12,000 years ago, which is 0.012 million years ago, we might see upwards of 20 or so phases where glaciers are growing and then receding, and then growing and then receding. And you can imagine that that's going to really profoundly change the way plants and animals can mix up on the face of the planet as you change sea levels so dramatically that would allow land bridges and then submerge the land bridges and then open them up again and then submerge them again. And imagine that cycling 20 different times over 1.5 million years. And that's essentially what you see defining how we kind of get the modern ecological blueprint that we see for planet Earth for today, the modern phase. So there's some things here to kind of consider and think about with the entire Cenozoic era as kind of climate hallmarks or important considerations. You could also read those important considerations in Figure 23.1. Just keep in mind we've taken that last diagram and sort of turned it vertically, and then there's just a narrative description of what's going on in these phases. I recommend you read it, but it's really just what I'm going over in slide form here. And then I'll just kind of give you the bullet points of what those time periods would look like. So here is the sort of the Cliff Notes version of that previous figure. going from Paleocene on the bottom, so from oldest phase of the Cenozoic to the most modern phase of the Cenozoic, the Holocene. And then in the years here show the time since the beginning of that epoch. And of course, we're talking about epochs within the Cenozoic era. So if we look at the very beginning of the Cenozoic, that's where the Mesozoic ends. It's where the KT extinction event is found. That's that dinosaur asteroid event that resulted in dinosaurs going extinct. Everything smaller than, or then bigger than 5 kilos essentially goes extinct. Birds and mammals make it through that bottleneck and end up, occupying all this open ecological real estate. So that ecological real estate, which is vacated by dinosaurs, is pretty rapidly filled in by mammals. Remember, mammals are diversifying rapidly and not leaving a lot of morphological cues as to the route that their morphological evolution takes. But by 10 million years later, so if we go from 65 million years ago to 55 million years ago, that's when we see the Earth during the Cenozoic, we see the Earth at its absolute hottest. So the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum would be drawn in there at that transition from one epoch to the other. At this phase, the planet is so warm that there's tropical plants and tropical animals migrating all over the planet, and the route of migration is going to be through the North Pole. Essentially, the North Pole is tropically forested at this time during the PETN. And this is a time period where we see the modern orders, most of those 19 orders of placental mammals are established by this time, or start to show up at this time, like primates, rodentia, carnivora, Paracedactyla, Cetacea, Artiodactyla, all those different orders, especially the ones that I mentioned, to make special connections with. Those are all first observed by the Eocene. The Eocene then, of course, goes through a period of cooling and drying, and by the end of the Eocene, you get to the Grand Coupé, that great cut event, and then moving into the Oligocene, a lot of those archaic mammals from the end of the Cretaceous and the beginning of the Cenozoic all go extinct with that great cut. Earth climates are cool and dry, but what persists through that are the modern orders of mammals, the modern 19 placental mammal groups, the modern marsupial ordinal level groups in Australia and in America. Those are all essentially on the planet by then and are with us to the present day. From the Miocene, that's just the next phase in the Cenozoic. So now we're really talking about the middle of the Cenozoic, about 23 million years ago. The South Pole, the Antarctic, is glaciated by this point, big ice sheets on the Antarctic as part of this trend of cooling and drying. By the Pliocene, so 5 million years ago, the North Pole is glaciated with ice sheets. And then by the Pleistocene, we get the ice ages. Pleistocene is this period of time where the ice sheets are growing and contracting over and over and over again, maybe a dozen or two times, profoundly shaping the way in which plants and animals could sort of access different continents that they might need land bridges for. And then we get into the Holocene, which is our modern time period, and the time since the beginning of this epoch is only 10,000 years ago. So modern anthropomorphic time, or Anthropocene time, that's another way of saying it, not anthropomorphic, but the Anthropocene is what some scholars propose we call the modern era, that the Holocene is over 10,000 years ago and the Anthropocene has begun. And so the Anthropocene, we are 10,000 years into the Anthropocene, the age of man, human, I should say. And this age is marked by, you name it, environmental degradation, plastics, deforestation, CO2 increases, temperature increases, maybe more climate instability, the extinction of lots of large animals, what we call the megafauna, in the land and in the sea. So these are the effects that I think we see in the news and we hear about in popular science all the time about how the Earth is changing and how humans are playing such a profound role in that change. So geologists and scholars have suggested that we call this time period the Anthropocene, and mark it as a new phase of time for the history of the Earth, as if an alien archaeologist, a billion years in the future, would look at the surface of Earth and recognize that something changed 10,000 years ago. So, now what were the continents doing during this time? Remember, Pangaea, during the Jurassic is when Pangaea, that supercontinent, starts its modern phase of splitting and breaking into pieces and spreading all over the planet. The Atlantic Ocean forms at that phase of time. Remember, the end of the Mesozoic is where those supercontinents that used to make up Pangaea, Laurasia and Gondwana, they begin to further fragment throughout the Cretaceous. And by the time the Cenozoic begins, there's geographic isolation of flora and fauna in the Americas and in Africa, separate from Antarctica and Australia and Eurasia. So that's all the consequence of the further breakup of Pangaea, the further breakup of Laurasia and Gondwana, and all of this is shaping biological evolution. The trend through the Cenozoic is that organisms are becoming progressively more different on different continents. So the trend of cooling and drying climate-wise is a trend of continents moving apart, continent shifting-wise, and then biological evolution-wise is such that organisms are becoming more different on different continents. Would be a way of thinking about describing that. However, there are still land bridges that occur intermittently, and the ice ages are going to have a profound effect on the availability of these land bridges, and what they allow is for the dispersal of animals, that animals do not just simply have to be passive riders on a moving continent, but that actually dispersing from one continent to another is more realistic, and land bridges are oftentimes invoked to describe how animals and plants from one region can migrate or shift and move to another. Now, where land bridges would have existed that were important during the ice ages and various stages of the Cenozoic would be New Guinea to Australia to Antarctica to South America. So these former Gondwanan continents that would have been closer together in previous years would just be even easier to link together with land bridges. Europe and North America, of course, is linked together by land bridges through the polar area at various times. Siberia in North America, so this is the Russian, the nearness we are to Russia is through Siberia up by Alaska. And so there's actually a very easily to discern land bridge there. You just have to remove some water from the ocean to reveal it. And then, of course, India bridges with Asia, not so much in a land bridge, but actually colliding with Asia to make the Himalayas. All of that affecting how animals are dispersing through the Cenozoic. The ecosystems that are in these terrestrial environments are closely tied to the climate and to the continent's position. The pattern of land masses is moving away from the poles, away from the equator, toward the poles and away from the equator. So it's almost like the continents are just maximally spreading apart from one another. This promotes then land masses at the northern poles where the potential to get the coldest is greatest. So we start to see then glacial ice caps form, first in the Antarctic and then second in the Arctic. But the high latitudes of the polar region don't have to be covered in ice to be considered changing. The areas near the polar regions are becoming cooler and drier, and so areas that used to be tropical are then becoming temperate. So temperate forests and temperate style ecosystems are evolving really for the first time on Earth. The kind of temperate ecosystems that we rely on today are really just an anomaly of the Cenozoic, that they never existed before that. So these are new regions that are sort of changed from the more primitive, the more ancestral tropical habitats, which on modern Earth, those tropical habitats are relegated to more equatorial regions. And of course, it's on this landscape that birds and mammals are diversifying. Birds, of course, diversifying into about 10,000 species, and mammals diversifying into about 5,000 species. So we call this the age of birds and mammals. However, it's worth remembering that that the teleost fish from the ray-fin bony fish, they're also a product of the Cenozoic. Teleost fish did not exist in the Paleozoic, right? I mean, the Paleozoic 500 million years ago to 250 million years ago, that was a time period of fish evolution, but not for modern crown groups of fish like teleosts and euteleosts. So if we really want to name an age based on the diversity or the success of a particular group, perhaps we ought to mention the Cenozoic as the age of teleost fish, just as much as it might be the age of mammals and birds. However, I would argue that mammals and birds are much more profoundly engaged in shaping the terrestrial ecosystem than of course, fish could ever be. So the hothouse world that starts the Cenozoic is just a mention of the fact that it begins very warm. Tropical conditions are all over the place during the hothouse world stage. At very high latitudes even, tropical forests are found. So imagine a forest, a tropical forest with broadleaf plants and just lush, dense understories and multi-tiered structure to the tree canopy. These kinds of forests at a polar region where they're in 3 months of darkness per year and then 3 months of almost constant sunlight per year. Just like if you were to live up at the North Pole today, 3 months out of the year you're practically in you're in dusk or in dark, and then 3 months of the year you're in kind of lighted daylight conditions. So these are forests of the hothouse world that are unlike anything today. Tropical forests, but tropical forests that are trained to withstand prolonged darkness that would have been different from equatorial tropical forests of this hothouse world climate. And so we can think about forests becoming so dominant during this hothouse world period of time because dinosaurs had just gone extinct. Not only that, but angiosperm plants were going through their own evolution, producing new successful types of flowering, fruiting plants, including many different types of trees that end up being critical to the success of the consumers of the products of those trees, birds and mammals. But dinosaurs used to be the consumers of all of these trees, many of them anyway, and once large-bodied browsing dinosaurs are gone, we can imagine that not only is it the angiosperm evolution that's responsible for this, but also just the fact that you remove any of the large animals that could actually crop that vegetation, and the result is just the abundance of forest resources. And animals under 5 kilos, like the primitive birds and mammals that make it through that bottleneck, are going to then explode in diversity. And so these forests dominate after the dinosaur browsers are gone, and they dominate from the beginning of the Cenozoic, the Paleocene, all the way into the early Eocene. So they go up through that Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum. That hothouse world phase is a phase of tropical forests dominating all over the world, even into northern climates. And so this is really just a scene from a terrestrial ecosystem in Europe during the Eocene. And it's a tropical forest. This would have been something that we saw all around the circumpolar area of the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum. So these kinds of tropical conditions that were in Europe would have been around Asia, and they would have connected to the United States because there was biogeographical exchange happening. I shouldn't say United States, North America. There was biogeographical exchange happening between North America and Eurasia through this circumpolar forested region. Mammals, of course, are inheriting this heavily forested world, and by the beginning of the Eocene, this lush tropical forest is sort of almost covering all land masses on the planet. And this is the environment that the earliest primates and rodents and many modern groups of mammals first originate in and become very successful in. But it's not just mammals, it's birds too. There's a lot of arboreal niches then, because these are forested settings. So a lot of these early mammals, early placental mammals from the earliest Eocene, were somehow arboreally adapted, to various degrees, as are birds. Let's look at this diagram again. We saw it earlier, just as a map of what's happening to the climate during the Cenozoic. It's getting cooler, it's getting drier. That begins at around 45 million years ago. So the icehouse world phase takes over where the hothouse world ended. And remember the Great Cut, this extinction event that kind of culls all the older mammals and only preserves the newer crown groups of placentals and marsupials. That event happens here around 35 million years ago. It's not a sudden event like an asteroid impact. It's kind of a slow event, which is what we would expect if the event is being driven by cooling. So what happens during the icehouse world is that vegetation zones or vegetation areas of the planet start to become increasingly zonal, meaning they're becoming increasingly different from one another and unique to only themselves. So we see zonality in climate, and it's a climate that's becoming cool and dry, and these are temperate climates. So things that we associate today with many of the things we see around us in Georgia, like temperate woodlands, temperate grasslands, those are all modern. Those are products of this icehouse world, Earth evolution. The savannas, the savannas of Africa, or other land masses that are warm, but they're large and arid and not densely forested. Prairies that are just basically grasslands without any trees. Steppe, tundra, taiga, deserts. These are increasingly hostile places in both Arctic and hot climates that didn't exist when the Earth was in that hothouse phase. So as we move through the icehouse world, this really culminates with what happens during the ice ages. And during the ice ages, there's over 24 different major and minor glacial cycles. And this is all happening in about a 1.5 to 2 million year phase of time during the Pleistocene. So this is right up to the present time, is where that trend of cooling and drying and zonality and icehouse world trend culminates in the ice ages of the Pleistocene. So what happens when you have a glacial maximum? So if we look at the 18,000-year-old Earth versus a present-day Earth, we can see that the ice, the actual glacial ice being the white masses, were much more extensive at this period of maximal glaciation 18,000 years ago. But imagine this ice cap forming 24 different times. That means it has to grow and shrink and grow and shrink dozens of times between its present, its low ice mass state and its high ice mass state. So what that does is, of course, change the margins of the ocean. When, I think we talk about that all the time now, because, of course, as global warming, as we watch climate change and the world warm, what we can expect is that there's less glacial ice, and therefore there's more water in the oceans, and so coastal margins are further back, are retreated onto the coasts, and it means that sea level's higher, and places that are exposed land become submerged with water. And that's true for these green areas. These large swaths of green land indicate where land is above sea level, and North America, from Alaska over to Asia through Siberia and Russia, was all connected. At each time there is a glacial maximum. So when the ice caps have pulled 140 meters worth of water, or 140 meters of depth worth of water out of the ocean, you can imagine the boundaries for continents are going to be profoundly different. So today there's water separating Eurasia and North America, but up to 24 different times through the Pleistocene there actually was a land bridge there. So they're disappearing and appearing routinely throughout the Pleistocene, not just in Alaska not just in North America to Asia, but in many places around the planet. So as we map on the dispersion of mammals on top of this, it's important to point out that this is really the profound shaper of mammal evolution, is the dispersal of animals on land bridges and not the vicariance of mammals across land bridges. This dispersal term reflects actual animal movement, so animals walking across a land bridge, physically migrating from one region to another, as opposed to vicariance, which reflects just being a passive rider on a moving land mass. And the way we understand the evolution of terrestrial ecosystems and mammals especially throughout the Cenozoic is really by mammal dispersal and not through vicariance. These separate evolutions of different land masses yields convergent evolution in certain mammal ecomorphological types, and we see this when we compare placental mammals to marsupial mammals in different parts of the world. So there's a few examples I want to talk about and some things in the book that mention these ecomorphological types. For example, there are marsupial versions of social insect feeders that are sort of parallel and similar in ways to placental versions of social insect feeders. Or the same thing could be true for gliders. There's a flying squirrel and a gliding placental mammal, but then there's also sugar gliders, which are little gliding, flying marsupial mammals. Or there are also ecological or ecomorphological types that we can compare through just all of these Australian marsupials. So here's another example that's beyond the social insect feeder and the glider, and that is being a carnivore. So in quotes is this term panther, and so we think about a panther as being a cat, a predatory cat, and a modern placental panther we know is in the order Carnivora, and it's got the carnassial between the fourth premolar and the first molar. Remember, that's that cutting surface. And what's kind of cool is that if we look at certain marsupials that are extinct now in Australia, it was a panther-sized, a large cat-sized extinct predator, top predator, that had a similar carnassial, but not made from a fourth upper premolar and a first lower molar, but made from two third premolars. So it's an upper and a lower third premolar. It's an analogous, not homologous similarity. It's a complete convergence in how you get a predatory dental configuration. So we have a marsupial version of a panther and a placental version of a panther. These would be different ecomorphological types due to animal dispersal, separate evolution on different land masses, and then their convergent evolution. And then we also see many examples as grazers. So for example, a marsupial grazer like a kangaroo occupies the same kind of ecological space as a placental grazer like this impala. And the two have to ferment cellulose grasses. They have to ferment this with bacteria in their stomachs, so they share some adaptive similarity in their digestive systems. But we can also see examples of these sort of the adaptation of convergent ecomorphological types by the isolation of lemurs in Madagascar. And then we also see different versions of this through the isolation of South America from North America, and then from both the Americas' isolation from the old world. So the new world would be the Americas, the old world would be Eurasia and Africa, and the Americas are separated from the new world was separated from the old world, and then further in the new world, the Americas have been separated from one another. So just to say a bit about the lemurs of Madagascar, they show us a unique trajectory of evolution. There's no other primates in Madagascar other than lemurs, and so they've evolved to occupy all modern primate habitats. So they're extinct now, but there were gorilla-sized lemurs, there are mouse-sized lemurs, and then there's essentially everything in between, and they occupy all the other primate niches in other parts of the world that are dominated by monkeys and apes. And on Madagascar, there are lemurs that are adapted to kind of occupy that ecosystem in that way. But there are also analogs, to hedgehogs. So mammal known as a tenrec, which is not phylogenetically the same as a hedgehog, in Madagascar is a hedgehog analog. And then there's a cat sort of predator analog that is not actually a cat. It's not a felid. It is in the mustelid family, where weasels and mongooses are. And in fact, in Madagascar, there is this animal known as a fossa, which looks just like a cat and actually has converged on cats, but is more closely related to mongooses. So some other examples of just some unique things happening that relate to biogeography and animal and mammal dispersal and the coevolution of ecomorphotypes in different parts of the planet. And then finally, the last example will be through the Americas. The New World is North America and South America, and it was isolated from the Old World for a long time, and so the flora and the fauna of the New World have been sort of on their own for starting about 45 million years ago. But at about 2.8 million years ago, South America finally made contact with North America. So South America has been more isolated than North America has been, but until about 2.8 million years ago is when the Americas first started exchanging their ecosystems, their flora and fauna, and it means that North America has a pretty distinct type of fauna compared to South America. But the fact that they're joined together where the country of Panama sits means that actually provides a land bridge connecting these two. So we start to see roughly 3 million years ago, the slow sharing of some of these animals across this boundary between North and South America. But what Panama also does 2.8 million years ago is really kickstart the ice ages, because by establishing land between the two Americas, it blocks these circum-equatorial currents where water can flow in a circle around the planet and stay really, really warm. And so what that means is that once you've blocked those equatorial currents circulating around the planet, then it kickstarts some pretty dramatic cooling episodes that, of course, are the ice ages. So that's all we've got. Good luck for the final.